The arena lights dimmed to a single spotlight. 30,000 fans packed into the Smoothie King Center in New Orleans, their voices creating a thunderous wall of sound that could shake the very foundations of the building. But this wasn't the roar of adoration that had followed Terry Gene Bolley, known as Hulk Hogan, for over 4 decades. This was something else entirely. Something that would cut deeper than any steel chair to the back, any finishing move, any betrayal storyline ever could. This was the sound of a hero falling from grace, and the man beneath the yellow mustache was about to face the most devastating opponent of his career. His own legacy. What happened on that night in New Orleans wasn't just another wrestling storyline. It was the culmination of a journey that began in the sweaty gymnasiums of Florida in the 1970s and ended with one of the most beloved figures in sports entertainment walking away to a chorus of boos that would echo in his heart forever. This is the story of how America's Golden Boy became wrestling's most complicated figure, and why his final bow felt more like a funeral than a farewell. Picture this: a young Terry Bollea, 6'7" of him, standing in Hiro Matsuda's wrestling school in 1976, his body screaming in agony as the legendary trainer put him through grueling sessions that would break lesser men. Matsuda was known for his brutality in training, and on Hogan's very first day, he deliberately broke the rookie's leg. It was a test, Matsuda later explained, to see if this blonde giant from Tampa had the heart of a warrior. Terry could have walked away. Instead, he came back 6 weeks later, cast barely off, ready for more punishment. That determination, that refusal to quit, would become the foundation of everything Hulk Hogan represented. But it was also the beginning of a pattern that would define his entire career: the blurring of lines between the character and the man, between Terry Bollea and the larger-than-life persona he would create. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In those early days, Terry bounced around different wrestling territories, playing various characters: a villain here, a mid-card talent there. But everything changed when he walked into Vince McMahon's Sr.'s Worldwide Wrestling Federation in 1979. McMahon saw something special in this charismatic giant with the bleach-blonde mustache and the ability to connect with crowds in a way that transcended traditional wrestling demographics. By 1984, when Vince McMahon Jr. was revolutionizing the wrestling business, Hulk Hogan had become the perfect vessel for McMahon's vision of sports entertainment. The timing was magical. MTV was launching, American patriotism was surging under Ronald Reagan, and families were looking for heroes they could cheer for together. Hogan, with his training regimen, his prayers, and his vitamins, became more than a wrestler. He became a symbol of American optimism. Those glory days seem almost mythical now. Picture the scene at WrestleMania 3 in 1987. 93,000 screaming fans at the Pontiac Silverdome, watching Hogan slam the seemingly impossible two-lift Andre the Giant, the flashbulbs going off like lightning across the arena, the deafening roar of approval, the sense that this moment would live forever in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. For Hogan, standing in that ring with his arms raised, it must have felt like touching the face of God. But success, especially success on that level, comes with a price that's not always visible to those watching from the outside. Behind the scenes, the man who preached about saying your prayers and eating your vitamins was struggling with his own demons. The pressure to maintain his image, to be the hero that millions expected him to be, was crushing. The physical toll of decades of performing at the highest level was breaking down his body, but more importantly, it was creating a disconnect between who Terry Bollea was and who Hulk Hogan needed to be. The first major crack in the facade came in 1994, when Hogan shocked the wrestling world by turning heel, becoming a villain and forming the New World Order with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in World Championship Wrestling. For many fans, this felt like a betrayal. The man who had taught them to believe in themselves, to never give up, to be true Americans. Was suddenly spray painting NWO across championship belts and acting like everything he had stood for was a lie. But for Hogan, it was liberating. Finally, he could explore the darker aspects of his character, the frustrations that had been building for years. The crowd's boos felt different than they were part of the act, part of the storyline. They were choosing to hate him, and he was giving them permission to do so. It was controlled, it was professional, and most importantly, it was temporary. What happened decades later in that New Orleans arena was something entirely different. Those boos weren't part of a storyline. They weren't the result of a heel turn or a betrayal angle. They were the sound of genuine disappointment, of fans who felt that their childhood hero had let them down in ways that couldn't be fixed with a simple face turn or an emotional promo. The events that led to that moment had been building for years, but they exploded into public view in 2015. When audio recordings surfaced of Hogan using racial slurs in a private conversation from 2007, the WWE, the company that had built much of its modern success on Hogan's broad shoulders, immediately terminated his contract and removed him from their Hall of Fame. Sponsorship deals evaporated overnight. The man who had once been the face of professional wrestling became persona non grata in the industry he had helped create. For 3 years, Hogan lived in a kind of professional exile. The man who had thrived on the adoration of crowds, who had fed off the energy of packed arenas, was suddenly cut off from the thing that had given his life meaning for over 4 decades. During this period, those close to him say he aged visibly, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like the heaviest wrestling hold he'd ever endured. The road back wasn't easy. And it wasn't guaranteed. In 2018, WWE quietly reinstated Hogan to their Hall of Fame, but it was a conditional return. He would have to prove himself all over again, show that he had grown, changed, learned from his mistakes. For a man in his 60s, starting over wasn't just professionally challenging, it was emotionally devastating. When WWE announced that Hogan would be making an appearance at their show in New Orleans, it was positioned as a homecoming of sorts. Louisiana had always been wrestling country, and Hogan had performed there countless times during his career. The hope, perhaps, was that Southern hospitality and nostalgia might overcome the complicated feelings many fans still harbored. But the moment Hogan's music hit, and he stepped through those curtains, it was clear that this wasn't going to be the redemption story anyone had hoped for. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. These weren't just casual boos, they were sustained, angry, personal. Signs in the crowd made it clear that many fans hadn't forgotten or forgiven. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration was now fighting for basic acceptance. Standing in that ring, Hogan tried to do what he had always done: connect with the audience. Find that spark that had made him special for so many years. He struck his classic poses. He cupped his ear to the crowd in that familiar gesture that had once been met with thunderous approval. But instead of the "what you're gonna do" chant that had followed him for decades, he heard only rejection. Those who were backstage that night say they had never seen Hogan look so small. The man who had body slammed giants, who had stared down the biggest names in the business without flinching, looked genuinely hurt. His shoulders sagged slightly, his usual bravado seemed forced. And for the first time in his career, Hulk Hogan looked like exactly what he was: a 70-year-old man facing the consequences of his choices. The aftermath was almost as painful to watch as the event itself. Hogan, who had always been quick with a quote or a story, was unusually quiet. When he did speak to the media, his words carried a weight that his usual bravado couldn't mask. He talked about disappointment, about hoping for a different reception, about the difficulty of facing a crowd that had once loved him unconditionally. But perhaps the most telling moment came in a backstage interview where Hogan, thinking the cameras had stopped rolling, was caught rubbing his temples and staring. at the floor. When asked if he was okay, he simply said, "I thought they would remember the good times too." It was a moment of vulnerability that revealed the human being beneath the character. The man who had given everything to entertain people and was struggling to understand why that wasn't enough to earn forgiveness. The wrestling business has always been about redemption stories. Heroes fall, villains find their way back to the light, and audiences are generally willing to forgive if the story is compelling enough. But Hogan's situation was different because his mistakes hadn't happened in the ring, they had happened in real life. And real life doesn't follow wrestling storylines. Yet, even in that moment of rejection, there was something profound happening. The crowd's reaction, as harsh as it was, represented something important: accountability. Fans weren't willing to separate the character from the man anymore. In an era where public figures are increasingly held responsible for their actions and words, Hogan was facing a reckoning that transcended sports entertainment. The tragedy isn't just that Hogan fell from grace, it's that he fell so far. From being a symbol of American heroism to being booed by the very people who had once considered him their champion. The journey represents one of the most dramatic reversals in entertainment history. But there's also something deeply human about it, something that speaks to our capacity for both great achievement and great failure. In the weeks following that New Orleans appearance, Hogan largely retreated from the public eye. Those close to him say he spent time reflecting on his career, his legacy, and his future. The man who had once been addicted to the roar of the crowd was learning to find peace in silence. Perhaps that's the real story here, not the fall of a hero, but the evolution of a human being. Terry Bollea created Hulk Hogan to be everything he thought people wanted: strong, confident, unbeatable, and morally pure. But real people aren't characters in a wrestling storyline. Real people make mistakes, face consequences, and have to find ways to live with the choices they've made. The boos in New Orleans weren't just about past mistakes, they were about the complexity of hero worship in the modern age. We build our heroes up so high that when they inevitably reveal their humanity, the fall feels personal. We feel betrayed not just by their actions, but by our own willingness to believe they were more than human in the first place. As the lights went down in that New Orleans arena and Hulk Hogan walked back through those curtains for what might be the final time, he carried with him more than just the sting of rejection. He carried the weight of a career that had brought joy to millions, the responsibility of mistakes that had caused real harm, and the knowledge that sometimes saying you're sorry isn't enough to heal the wounds you've created. The Hulk Hogan story isn't over, but that chapter, the chapter where he could count on the love and support of wrestling fans, has clearly ended. What comes next is unwritten, but it will have to be authored by Terry Bollea, not by the character he created to hide behind. And maybe, in the end, that's the most important lesson of all: that our heroes are human. That redemption is possible, but not guaranteed. And that, sometimes the most devastating opponent we face is the truth about ourselves. The arena in New Orleans has long since emptied. The echoes of those boos have faded into memory, but the impact of that moment continues to reverberate. It serves as a reminder that in a world where we're constantly asked to separate the art from the artist, sometimes they become so intertwined that when one falls, they both do. And sometimes that fall is the most honest moment of all.